Hi all, let's have a look at one of the amazing games coming out of the Leuven Blitz in Belgium. This is Magnus Carlsen against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. So this is in round 12, 2nd of July 2017. C4 from Magnus, so English opening at the moment, and now E3. And this is of course instructive for me, because if I kick off the game with E3 and they play E5, I could get this position with C4. We're combining a kind of reverse French defense with reverse Sicilian defense. And now, after knight f6, knight c3 is very logical, waiting to be able to take here and open up that c file. Knight c6, but we also have, into the mixture of systems, a kind of grob move now, g4. So Basman was keen with g4 on the first move. So this aims to sometimes control that d5 square. But there's other ideas in the grob which actually Magnus makes use of. After bishop b4, g5, white gets this bishop pair. But what good is the bishop pair if this bishop's blocked in later? So this is another fantastic idea. The pawn is slightly vulnerable. Instead of protecting it, one of the kind of more aggressive ideas of the grob system is to sometimes use that as a pawn sack to get active rook on the g file, pressure on the g file. But so white's interested in boosting all his pieces here, like this bishop on c1, this rook on h1. So yeah, a very interesting idea is sacking that pawn. And also now after queen g5 we get some other effect that this bishop is also kind of targeted. First this knight's kicked, but now this pawn move locks in the counterpart bishop over there. So this one's saying to this one, haha, I'm not blocked in and you are. So very interesting pawn sack, this whole idea of sacking the g pawn there. Black kind of accepts imprisonment with c6. What else can he do here? If he takes, it might be worse actually. If he took, then there's things like bishop a3 and queen takes d6 to follow. This might be even more dangerous in a practical sense. So c6, it looks like a really miserable move, imprisoning that bishop. So white is also gaining with tempo, knight f3, and now rook g1. Look at all of white's pieces. From a practical point of view, this is much easier to play with the white pieces. From an engine point of view, it might be, the engines might think black's okay, but really this is so difficult for black to actually play here. The immediate threat is parried with knight e6. And now another startling move. I wonder if you can guess it if I give you 5 seconds starting from now. Okay, both bishop engines are activated now with e4. This opens up this bishop as well. So we've got both bishops kind of activated. Maybe this one needs a bit more activation later. But this, after e4, queen takes e4 check. Bishop e3, it's all about the bishops being really active and the pieces being really active. And yeah, this is getting dangerous. Bishop d3 threatens immediately to trap the queen. So the queen moves. We have queen f5. Now knight g5, very interesting to be able to take on e6 and then crash through on g7. We have knight f4 trying to parry that idea. White gives up one of the bishops. This is taking out one of black's only active pieces. It's only the queen that's around at the moment. And the queen is subject to tempo gain, rook g4, and again knight e4. Now after queen f3, white is potentially threatening here queen g3, hitting e5. This is a very, very tricky part of the game here. Maxime Vachier-Lagrave plays knight f6, probably expecting knight takes f6, which actually technically this position, if we just get this simplification, is about equal here. You know, black has paid something for that knight f6 here, and this from, you know, from a technical engine point of view is about equal. Or even if anyone's better, it's maybe black can start wriggling out with b6. But Magnus keeps the tension in the position. He plays a really, really interesting move here. I wonder if you can guess it if I give you 5 seconds to pause the video. What would you consider playing with white? Okay, it's a bit of a stunner. Rook takes g7, and black is probably shell-shocked by this move, and he immediately plays probably not the most accurate reply. Basically, clearly, it's very dangerous for black. You know, the worst move would be knight takes, because that's the mate in 2. But the best move is probably king f8 here. So giving the option of king takes g7, it's a very, very calm, resourceful response. No panic about it. King f8. If the rook goes back, then actually this d6 pawn might actually be a liability. Knight takes and queen takes d6, and a lot of black's problems are solved now. This might be, you know, okay, or even slightly better for black technically. But Magnus is playing against a human who panicked here. Yeah, this causes a panic. Queen takes g7, and immediately white has got masses of compensation here on the dark squares. By taking out g7, f6 has been weakened, and e5. There's a whole ripple effect on the dark squares, which we start to see now. After knight takes, we start to see this from this position, that there are actually issues now on other dark squares. So an amazing practical decision for Magnus, causing a suboptimal, you know, human reply. It is just Blitz after all as well. So interesting moments here. The king goes to d8. Let's have a quick look at this. If king f8, queen f5 may be the key move, with queen takes e5 to follow. And it's difficult for black to actually do something about this. For example, this position is pretty miserable with these two threats. You can see it's not just about the bishop being blocked in, it's the interruption on the whole back row, especially with this pawn. This is another attacking piece basically near the king. So there's some dire issues here for black to solve. We'd have to actually give up a rook here, which is not very nice. This is just totally lost for black, this position. Okay, things like queen d8 to follow. So yeah, the king actually goes to d8, preparing actually to shuffle the rook here, so making space for the rook to go there. Queen f5, rook e8 to countersack the exchange to defend e5. On b6, this is just end of game after queen takes e5, for example, like this, and it's just mating. So black has to actually sack the exchange here with rook e8 to defend. That's taken, and now this bishop is activated, c5, activating that bishop. We have b5, at least trying to stop the use of the c4 square. I mean, c4 might be useful, but bishop d3. Black's not interested in the h7 pawn here, and there's no time to try and win a rook. You just get mated, for example, check. It's just a way of getting mated over here. Queen takes e5, and then queen h8, checkmate. That pawn is part of the mating net there. So there's no time for any material hunting. f6 is played. We have king e2, and this is a very interesting move coming up here after king f7. White really wants to be able to have an option of rook g1, but how to achieve that here? Black's really tied down to d7 in this position. So white plays a mysterious looking move here, which caught my attention really. I wonder if you can guess it if I give you 5 seconds starting from now. Mysterious looking move. What would you play here? Okay, rook h1. It seems ridiculous to put the rook behind the pawn, but it's actually like a sliding block puzzle, because then this king can go there and the rook can go there protected by the king. So it's by doing this, it's just making way for the king to come here. But also in some variations, h4 is also useful, supported by the rook. We have rook b8. Let me just show you one of those variations. I'm mentioning, I'm thinking of Queen G6, Queen F3. Here, Queen G5, there could be H4 utilizing that rook on H1. So it's like a mysterious rook move. And here, white is also ready with his passed H pawn. So this is winning for white, basically. So anyway, rook H1, rook B8 was played. Now King F1, so rook G1 is introduced. We have Queen G6, Queen F3 hitting the Queen. Queen goes to H6. Now finally rook G1. And there's ideas of rook G3 to H3, which will target H7. Bishop H6, finally black moves the bishop. But D7 is a target, which is immediately tapped into that weakness of the last move. Poor bishop. The rook is tied down now to defend that. Instead, rook G3. If check, I don't believe this is particularly good. After King G2, tempo gain there is a bit of a killer. So, humble move, rook D8, rook G3, E4. This looks pretty desperate. Queen takes E4. Now threatens Queen E7. Rook E8, Queen G4 hitting D7 again. And also potentially H7 is loose in these lines as well. So Bishop C8, King G2, taking away any potential checks there, which might have been useful. Queen G5, Queen F3, keeping the queens on for a moment. Queen D5, and it's here actually, Magnus does take on D5. Queens do come off. Bishop takes H7, threatening Bishop G6. So it wasn't just winning the pawn, it was getting that G6 square to be able to threaten Bishop G6. Rook E5 coming out with the firing line there on the diagonal. F4, we have this check. Rook takes H2, but now check here, so getting that center pawn with the immediate threat of Rook G8 checkmate. That's parried. King F2, Bishop A6, and now the king marches up the board in this final phase. King D4, Rook G7, Rook on the 7th. White's got all the big positional trump cards here he could hope for. C6 undoubling his pawns technically, and crashing through much more effectively now. There's rook, the rook on the 7th is much more effective rather. So A5, the king coming into C5, and the game ended here. It's a very miserable looking position visually. Let's have a look. Say B4, C4. Let's say F5, Rook A7. Yeah, black's not really doing much here. Say this, Rook A8, that nasty pin. So with the threat of Bishop B7, white can just start picking off the pawns at leisure. And eventually, you know, black's going to have to do something desperate like that, because if black doesn't do something desperate, well, let's say Rook G7, Rook A8, and there's the threat, for example, of sometimes D7, or even just Bishop D5 here. Let's see, Bishop D5 might even be better just to go for that C8 without losing anything. So this is the kind of thing, pardon me, Bishop E6. So it looks fairly hopeless, this endgame scenario. Let's look where the game ends again. If we throw in the check, King B6, this position is, yeah, it's just all pretty hopeless. White's gonna play this, probably ideally, which threatens that mate to get that nasty pin. So once that happens, we have similar situations before, or even with D7, let alone that bishop move. D7 here is killing. Okay, so it's a totally killing final position, and yeah, it just shows really, for me as a Blitz player, as you know from the Kingscrusher channel, well, my first lesson from this game is to combine the reverse French with the reverse Sicilian and the machismo grob with the gambit. He basically, in doing that, both bishops were really activated fully later, and this bishop was hemmed in most of the game. D7 was an issue much of the game. There were constant threats to handle, basically, and the endgame favoured white basically massively, with rook coming into the position. Yeah, it was just a fantastically active, dynamic, aggressive blitz game from Magnus Carlsen, and shows it was like one of those wonderful Alexander Alekhine games, you know, with the dynamic pawn sack in the opening. It was a bit like that. There was actually a dynamic pawn sack in the opening here with that G pawn. If we just yeah, it's just a wonder. If we just appreciate the dynamic aggressiveness of this game, it really was amazing. So something to learn from here for sure, especially if you're a blitz player, to take these sort of risks. Comments, questions, likes, shares appreciated. Thanks very much.